My name is Lila Vaughn, and I'm 30 years old. I've always been a fiercely independent person, and I've worked hard to get to where I am today. My house, this little 2-bedroom haven, isn't just a building. It's a reflection of my journey. Every corner of it holds memories of late nights, long hours, and moments of quiet triumph. I bought it 5 years ago after saving every penny I could, often skipping dinners out and vacations just to make my dream come true. It's not extravagant, but it's mine, and that makes it perfect. That morning, sunlight poured through my living room window, casting a warm glow on the old hardwood floors I'd refinished myself. I was sipping coffee, relishing a rare moment of peace. Outside, my plants thrived in the small garden I'd built from scratch, each bloom a testament to my patience and care. I couldn't imagine feeling more content, but that feeling didn't last long. The knock at the door startled me. My parents, Evelyn and Arthur, had arrived unannounced, which wasn't unusual. They had a habit of barging into my life whenever it suited them, like it was their right. With them was my younger sister, Margot, the golden child, the one who always got her way. Her smile was dazzling as always, but something about it felt off. Too smug, too knowing. I should have been on guard, but I wasn't. "We need to talk," my mother said as soon as they stepped inside. Her tone was clipped, no pleasantries exchanged. My father followed silently, as he always did, and Margot trailed behind, looking around as though she were appraising the place. "What's going on?" I asked, setting my mug down on the counter. A knot was already forming in my stomach. Evelyn's face softened slightly, but it didn't make her words any less calculated. "Margot's getting married," she announced, her eyes flicking to her favorite child like she was presenting royalty. Margot beamed and held up her hand, showing off a ring that looked as if it had been plucked from a magazine. "That's great news," I said sincerely, even though I felt a twinge of discomfort. Weddings weren't exactly my thing, but I was happy for her. "Congratulations." "Thank you," Margot replied, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that always felt performative. Evelyn wasted no time before continuing. "We've been making plans, big plans. Margot deserves a wedding to remember, something grand, something spectacular. And Lila, we were hoping you'd help make that happen." I blinked, caught off guard. "Help? Sure, I can pitch in. What do you need? Decorations? A venue suggestion?" Evelyn exchanged a look with Arthur, who cleared his throat awkwardly. "Not exactly," she said, her voice taking on a tone I recognized too well, the one she used when she wanted something unreasonable. "We were thinking bigger. You've done so well for yourself, Lila, with this house and all. You're not married, you don't have kids. It's not like you really need all of this space." My heart began to pound. "What are you saying?" Margot spoke up then, her voice syrupy and light. "Oh, come on, Lila. You could sell the house. It'd be more than enough to cover the wedding. And really, it's not like you couldn't just find another place later. You've always been good at starting over." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Sell my house? My home? To pay for her wedding? For a moment, I just stared at them, waiting for someone to laugh, to say it was all a joke. But no one did. Evelyn's expression was expectant. Arthur avoided my gaze, and Margot stood there looking as though this was the most logical thing in the world. "No," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "Absolutely not." Evelyn's face hardened immediately. "Lila, don't be so selfish. This is about family, about doing what's right." I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my composure. What's right? Selling the home I've worked so hard for to fund a single day? "That's not right, Mom. That's absurd." Margot's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of anger in her eyes. "You're ruining this for me," she snapped. "I knew you'd make this about you." I wanted to scream, to tell them all exactly how unfair this was, but I knew it wouldn't matter. I'd seen this dynamic play out my entire life. Margot would always be the center of attention, and I would always be expected to step aside for her. But this time, I wasn't going to. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "This conversation is over." Evelyn looked outraged, but Arthur placed a hand on her arm, murmuring something I couldn't hear. Margot stormed out, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. My parents followed, Evelyn shooting me a glare that promised this wasn't the end. As the door closed behind them, I stood there in silence, my heart pounding. I didn't know what they'd do next, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the door shut behind them, I felt the tension linger in the air, thick and suffocating. My hands trembled as I reached for my coffee, now cold, and sat down at the kitchen table. My heart was still racing. How could they even suggest such a thing? My house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was my life, my escape, my proof that I could thrive despite everything. The nerve of them to waltz in here and expect me to hand it over for a wedding, of all things. The thought of their entitled expressions replayed in my mind. Margot's smugness was the hardest to swallow. She had always been like this, spoiled, coddled, and completely unaware of what it meant to earn something for herself. But this time, she had crossed a line, and so had they. Later that afternoon, I tried to shake it off by focusing on my work, but my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. First, it was a text from my mother. "Lila, I can't believe how you acted today. This is your sister's wedding, and all you care about is your selfish needs. Do better." Then Margot, "Wow, I guess we know who the family's disappointment is. Thanks for nothing, sis." Each message felt like a dagger, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. By the evening, it wasn't just them. Calls and messages started pouring in from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. Evelyn had clearly wasted no time spinning her tale. "Lila, how could you do this to Margot? She's your sister. I heard you refused to help with the wedding. Isn't family supposed to come first? What's the big deal? It's just a house. You can always buy another one." The words came from people who had no idea what it had taken for me to get here. They didn't know the sacrifices I'd made or the countless times I'd been overlooked so Margot could shine. Yet, here they were, piling on, as if I owed them something, as if I hadn't done enough already. I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet of my living room, staring at the walls I'd painted myself and the shelves I'd built by hand. This was my space, my hard-earned reward. I wasn't going to let them guilt me into giving it up, but the silence brought memories I didn't want to revisit. Growing up, I was always the responsible one, the quiet one. Margot, on the other hand, was the star, loud, lively, and the apple of my parents' eyes. She was the one who got the extra dance lessons, the designer dresses, the constant praise. I was the one who made do with leftovers and learned how to fend for myself. I didn't resent her for being their favorite back then, but I resented how they always expected me to give and give while she only took. I wasn't angry about the wedding itself. I could understand wanting something beautiful, something special, but expecting me to sell my home for it? That was beyond selfish. It was cruel. And now they were trying to paint me as the villain for saying no. The next morning, I woke up to another message. This one was from Aunt Nora, my mother's sister and the unofficial family gossip. "You really upset your parents yesterday, Lila. They're devastated. You need to apologize and fix this. Family is everything." I nearly laughed out loud. Devastated. If anyone was devastated, it was me. But that was the way it always went with them. Evelyn, Arthur, and Margot. Their feelings always mattered more than mine. I was just the backup dancer in the Lila Vaughn show. Well, not anymore. By the time I arrived at work, I had resolved to stay firm. But my resolve was tested almost immediately when Camille, my best friend and coworker, pulled me aside. "Hey," she said, "are you okay?" "I saw your mom's post on Facebook last night and—" "What post?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Camille hesitated, then held out her phone. There it was, clear as day, a long, dramatic post from Evelyn, lamenting how some people in the family had forgotten the importance of love and sacrifice and refused to support their sister in her time of need. The comments were worse. Distant cousins and family friends chiming in about how terrible it was, how disappointed they were, how ungrateful I must be. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Camille looked at me, her eyes full of concern. "What's going on, Lila? Are you really not helping with the wedding?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Not helping? They want me to sell my house to pay for it." Her jaw dropped. "Are you serious? That's insane." "Yeah," I said, rubbing my temples, "but now I'm the bad guy for saying no." Camille shook her head. "Lila, you can't let them do this to you. You've worked too hard to let them take this away." Her words echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. She was right. I had worked too hard. And if my family thought they could bully me into submission, they were in for a rude awakening. That evening, as I sat on my couch with my phone turned off and a cup of tea that had gone cold, the weight of it all began to press down on me. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, dissecting every word and every glare. The messages from my relatives echoed in my mind, making my chest tighten. How had it come to this? How had a simple refusal to give up my home turned into an all-out assault on my character? My parents and Margot weren't just upset. They were orchestrating a campaign to turn the entire family against me. It was a tactic I'd seen them use before, but never on me. Growing up, I'd watched them rally relatives to Margot's side whenever she'd had a spat with a friend, a teacher, or even a boyfriend. They would weave stories to cast her as the victim, painting anyone who opposed her as cruel and unjust. Now, it was my turn to play the villain in their narrative. I decided to call Camille. She picked up on the first ring, her voice instantly warm and reassuring. "Hey, how are you holding up?" "I'm not," I admitted, my voice cracking. "They're dragging my name through the mud, Cam. It's like they're trying to break me." "You know why, right?" she said. "They've always counted on you to keep quiet and go along with whatever they want. The second you stand up for yourself, they lose control. That's what this is about. Control." Her words struck a chord deep inside me. Control. That was exactly it. For years, I had let them dictate the rules, let them pull the strings. But not anymore. "They've already booked the venue," I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like a slap. "They booked it before even asking me to sell the house." "What?" Camille's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're kidding." "Nope," I replied bitterly. "They assumed I'd say yes. They thought I'd just roll over like always." Camille was silent for a moment, then she said, "So, what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air. What was I going to do? I couldn't just sit back and let them smear my name. I had to protect myself, not just my house, but my dignity, my boundaries, my life. The next morning, I called a lawyer. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd have to do, but I needed to know my rights. I explained the situation, my voice shaking slightly as I recounted how my parents were trying to pressure me into selling my home. "You're under no obligation to sell your property," the lawyer assured me. "It's entirely yours, and no one can force you to do anything with it. If they continue to harass you, we can take steps to ensure your privacy and peace of mind." Hearing those words was a small but powerful comfort. For the first time in days, I felt like I had a bit of control again. But I knew this wasn't just about the law. This was about standing up to years of manipulation and favoritism. Later that day, I began gathering evidence. I went through my messages, screenshotting the ones where my mother and Margot had outright demanded I sell my house. I saved the Facebook post and its comments, all of which painted me as the family's black sheep. If they were going to twist the story to suit their agenda, I needed to be ready to defend myself. But as I pieced everything together, another thought occurred to me. What if this was just the tip of the iceberg? My parents weren't just desperate. They were overconfident. Booking a venue without securing the funds was risky, even for them. Was there something else I didn't know? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I resolved to find out. I wasn't going to let them bulldoze me into submission. They thought I'd fold under the pressure, but they were wrong. This time, I wasn't backing down. The next morning, I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. If my family was willing to go this far, I needed to understand just how deep their desperation ran. They hadn't just booked a venue on a whim. They were banking on me to cover their risks. I had a sinking feeling there was more to their story, and if I was going to protect myself, I needed to uncover it. I started with Margot. She was always the weak link when it came to secrets. Her love for drama often made her careless with details. I didn't plan to call her. She'd twist anything I said to suit her narrative. Instead, I scrolled through her social media. Margot loved to brag about her life online, often revealing more than she should. It didn't take long to find the breadcrumbs. Her recent posts were filled with cryptic captions like, "Big plans coming soon, stay tuned," alongside photos of luxury venues and designer gowns. One post in particular caught my attention. A selfie of her holding a glass of champagne with the caption, "When your wedding is set to be the event of the year, you celebrate early. Dream big." The comments were flooded with congratulations and excitement, but one stood out. Someone named Jasmine R. had written, "Girl, you're so brave taking on this kind of expense. Hope it all works out." Expense? My chest tightened as I reread the comment. Margot had always been reckless with money, but this felt different. I clicked on Jasmine's profile and quickly realized she worked for a high-end wedding planning company. My heart sank. If Margot had already hired a planner, this wedding wasn't just a venue and a dress. It was likely a full-blown production with a price tag to match. I debated whether to confront her directly, but decided against it. Margot would deny everything, or worse, spin it into another attack on me. Instead, I needed someone who might be honest, or at least let something slip. My father. Arthur Vaughn was a passive man, always eager to avoid conflict. He didn't push back against Evelyn or Margot, but he also lacked their sharpness when it came to covering their tracks. If anyone would let the truth slip, it would be him. I called him later that afternoon, keeping my tone casual. "Hey, Dad, can we talk?" "Lila," he said hesitantly. I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I'm sure," I replied dryly. "I wanted to clear the air. I feel like there's more going on with this wedding than I realize. You and Mom are clearly under a lot of pressure." There was a long pause. I could almost hear him debating whether to tell me the truth. Finally, he sighed. "It's been difficult. You know how your mother gets when she sets her mind on something." "Difficult how?" I pressed. "You've already booked the venue, Dad. What's really going on?" His voice wavered. "The truth is, your mother wanted this to be big, bigger than anything the family has done before. Margot insisted and, well, we didn't want to let her down. And," I prompted, sensing there was more, "and we might have overextended ourselves," he admitted quietly. "The deposits alone were steep, and your mother's convinced we can make it work. But without your help." His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest. "So, you're in debt? Is that what you're saying?" "Not yet," he replied quickly. "But if we can't cover the remaining payments soon, we might be. That's why your mother thought the house—" "The house that I worked my entire life for," I interrupted sharply. "Dad, this is insane. You're willing to jeopardize everything for one day?" "It's not just one day, Lila," he said weakly. "It's family." "No, Dad," I said firmly. "It's Margot. It's always Margot." I ended the call, my mind racing. So that was their game. They weren't just asking for help. They were trying to offload their financial mess onto me, counting on my guilt to make it work. But I wasn't about to play along. That evening, I called Camille and laid everything out for her. "They're in debt," I said bluntly. "They've probably blown through savings, and now they're scrambling to keep up appearances." Camille didn't sound surprised. "You know what that means, right? They're not going to stop. People like Evelyn don't take no for an answer." She was right, of course. My family wouldn't back down until they got what they wanted. But this time, I had no intention of giving in. I wasn't just protecting my house, I was protecting myself. If they wanted a fight, I was ready. And I had a feeling this fight was only just beginning. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in ways I hadn't expected, though I probably should have. Evelyn and Margot ramped up their campaign against me, calling every relative who would listen and painting a picture of my betrayal. The guilt tactics were relentless, and the messages from extended family became even more aggressive. "Lila, how can you sit by and watch your parents struggle like this?" one text read. "You're going to regret this when you're older and all alone," warned another. I didn't bother responding. At this point, it was clear that reasoning with them would be futile. Evelyn wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted total submission. And Margot? She wanted her dream wedding, no matter the cost or who had to pay for it. But their attacks didn't stop at words. I returned home one evening to find my mother's car parked in my driveway. My stomach dropped. She hadn't called, and I hadn't invited her over. As I got out of my car, she stepped out of hers, her arms crossed and her expression cold. "Can we talk?" she asked, though it sounded more like a demand than a question. "I don't think there's much left to say," I replied, keeping my tone even. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. She didn't. She followed me into the house, closing the door behind her. "Lila, I need you to stop being so stubborn. This isn't just about Margot's wedding, it's about family unity. Do you really want to be the reason this family falls apart?" I set my bag down and turned to face her. "Family unity? Is that what you're calling this? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like manipulation." Her face hardened. "You're being dramatic. All we're asking is for you to make a small sacrifice for your sister's happiness." "Small sacrifice?" I repeated, my voice rising. You're asking me to sell my house, Mom, my home, the one I worked my entire life to afford. That's not a small sacrifice. That's everything." She didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed emboldened by my anger. "You're overreacting. You're single. You don't have children. You don't need this much space. And think about it. After the wedding, Margot and her husband could help you find something smaller. You'd be fine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "Do you even hear yourself? You're trying to justify stealing my future for Margot's wedding." Her eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone, young lady. I'm your mother." "And I'm your daughter," I snapped. "But that's never mattered to you, has it? Not when Margot's involved." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For the first time, Evelyn looked genuinely taken aback. But the moment was fleeting. She quickly regained her composure and said, "You're making a huge mistake, Lila. If you don't help us, you'll regret it." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I replied, my voice steady. She stared at me for a long moment before finally turning toward the door. "Fine," she said. "But don't come crying to us when you realize how lonely it is to have no family." The door slammed behind her, and I stood there in the silence, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to cry, to punch something. But instead, I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was doing this. That night, I called Camille again. "They showed up at my house," I said, pacing my living room. "She tried to guilt me into thinking I was destroying the family." "What did you say?" Camille asked. "I told her no," I replied. "And I meant it." Camille was quiet for a moment before she said, "Good. They're trying to break you, Lila, but you're stronger than this. Just keep standing your ground." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that I could hold firm, that I could weather whatever storm my family threw at me. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. Evelyn didn't back down easily, and Margot, she was just getting started. And sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to a new message from Margot. This time, it wasn't a guilt trip or a demand. It was a simple statement that sent a chill down my spine. "You'll regret this, Lila. Trust me." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a battle. And something told me Margot had just declared war. Margot's message lingered in my mind like a dark cloud. "You'll regret this, Lila. Trust me." I couldn't shake the feeling that her words were more than just idle threats. Margot wasn't the type to sulk in silence. When she didn't get her way, she found ways to make everyone around her pay for it. By mid-afternoon, my suspicions were confirmed. A notification popped up on my phone. Margot had made a public post on social media. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The post was a carefully worded rant, dripping with passive-aggressive charm. It's so disappointing when family forgets the meaning of love and sacrifice. Some people only care about themselves, no matter how much others have done for them. But I won't let their selfishness ruin my big day. I deserve happiness, and I'll get it, with or without their support. Attached to the post was a picture of Margot in what looked like a wedding dress fitting, her face tilted in a dramatic display of sadness. The comments were predictably fawning. "You're so strong, Margot. Don't let anyone dim your light. Family should always support each other. You don't need that kind of negativity. You'll have the wedding of your dreams, no matter what." I clenched my jaw as I read through the responses. Margot had turned this into a spectacle, framing herself as the victim and casting me as the heartless villain. And it was working. People who didn't know the full story were rallying behind her, offering sympathy and support, while unknowingly fueling her manipulative narrative. I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the couch, my chest tight with frustration. They weren't just trying to guilt me privately anymore, they were taking this public. I couldn't ignore it. If I stayed silent, they'd twist the narrative until everyone believed I was some heartless monster who had turned her back on her family. But responding would only fan the flames. Evelyn and Margot wanted me to lash out. They wanted a reason to call me the problem. Think, Lila, I muttered to myself, pacing the room. Reacting emotionally would only give them more ammunition. I needed to stay calm, stay strategic. If they were going to escalate, so would I, but on my terms. That evening, I reached out to my lawyer again. This time, I explained the social media posts and the relentless campaign of guilt and manipulation. They're not just pressuring me privately anymore, I said. They're trying to humiliate me publicly. The lawyer listened patiently before responding. You have options, Lila. If their actions escalate into harassment or defamation, you can pursue legal action. But for now, I'd recommend documenting everything. Every post, every message, every attempt to contact you. The more evidence you have, the stronger your position will be if this continues. I nodded, taking a deep breath. It wasn't the immediate solution I craved, but it was a step. And I needed to remind myself that this wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about protecting my peace, my home, and my future. Later that night, I received a surprising call from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my cousin Clara. She and I had been close when we were younger, but life had pulled us in different directions. Still, I was relieved to hear a friendly voice. Hey, Lila, she said cautiously. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I saw what's happening with Margot and your parents. I wanted to check in and see if you're okay. Her concern caught me off guard. Thanks, Clara. Honestly, it's been a nightmare. They've taken this to a whole new level. I figured, she said. You know how Aunt Evelyn gets when she's fixated on something. But I wanted to tell you something. I don't think you're wrong. Actually, I know you're not. This whole thing is ridiculous, and everyone in the family knows how Margot is. Some of them just won't say it out loud. Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves. You really think so? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. I know so, she said firmly. And you're not alone in this. I'm on your side, Lila. We talked for over an hour, laughing about old memories and venting about family drama. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter. Clara's support reminded me that not everyone had bought into Evelyn and Margot's narrative. There were people who saw through the facade, even if they weren't vocal about it. But I also knew this wasn't over. Evelyn, Margot, and even Arthur weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And based on Margot's cryptic threat, I had a feeling their next move was already in motion. The storm wasn't just coming, it was here. But this time, I was ready for it. The next morning, I woke up to an ominous sense of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Sure enough, by mid-morning, it hit. My phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and texts from relatives, more frequent than usual. I hesitated before checking, dreading whatever new drama Evelyn and Margot had concocted. A text from my cousin Clara, who had been my one source of sanity through this ordeal, appeared at the top. Lila, have you seen this? Call me. My heart sank as I opened the attached link. It led to yet another public post, this time from Evelyn. She had outdone herself, crafting a melodramatic essay about family loyalty, complete with thinly veiled jabs at me. As parents, we sacrifice so much for our children, hoping they'll grow up to understand the importance of love and unity. It breaks our hearts when one of them chooses selfishness over family. But we won't let bitterness win. We'll keep moving forward and give Margot the wedding she deserves. True family never gives up. The comments were worse than before, full of condolences and moral grandstanding. Evelyn, you're such a strong mother. Don't let one bad apple ruin this special time. Margot is so lucky to have you fighting for her happiness. Some people just don't understand the meaning of family. Shame on whoever's putting you through this. This wasn't just a post. It was a declaration of war. Evelyn was rallying the troops, using her carefully curated words to frame herself and Margot as the noble victims of my supposed cruelty. I knew this wasn't just about guilt anymore. This was about publicly isolating me, ensuring that I had no allies left to lean on. Clara called before I could even process my thoughts. "Lila, this is getting out of hand," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Do they not see how unhinged this is?" "No, Clara," I said bitterly. "They see exactly what they're doing. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's calculated. Evelyn's always been good at turning people into pawns." Clara sighed. "You need to respond." I froze. Respond? To what? If I lash out, I look like the angry, ungrateful daughter they're painting me as. If I stay quiet, I look guilty. "I'm not saying post some angry rebuttal," Clara said. "But you need to get ahead of this somehow. Let people hear your side. They're not all brainwashed by Evelyn and Margot. You just need to show them the truth." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. She was right. Evelyn and Margot were loud and relentless, but their version of the story wasn't the only one that deserved to be told. And if I didn't speak up, I'd be handing them the victory they were so desperate for. That evening, I drafted a response. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like a minefield. Too emotional, too detached, too defensive. But eventually, I settled on something that felt true to me. There's been a lot of talk lately about family, sacrifice, and loyalty. I've stayed quiet because I hoped this could be resolved privately, but that hasn't been the case. The truth is, my family asked me to sell my home, something I've worked my entire life for, to pay for my sister's wedding. When I said no, they decided to publicly shame me instead. This isn't about selfishness or bitterness. It's about boundaries. It's about standing up for what's right. I love my family, but I also love the life I've built, and I won't apologize for protecting it. I read it over a dozen times, my finger hovering over the post button. My heart pounded as I imagined the backlash, the inevitable flood of angry responses. But then I thought of Evelyn, of Margot, of every moment I'd stayed silent while they steamrolled me. This time, I wouldn't. I hit post. Within minutes, the responses started pouring in. Some were supportive. "Good for you, Lila. Boundaries are important. Don't let them guilt you into giving up your dreams." Others, of course, were not. "You're twisting the story to make yourself look good. Selling a house for your sister isn't that big of a deal. Stop being so dramatic." But for every negative comment, there were messages of encouragement. Some from people I didn't even know, others from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. One message, in particular, stood out. A private note from my Aunt Teresa, one of Evelyn's younger sisters. "Lila, I've been following what's happening, and I just want you to know I'm on your side. Evelyn's always been like this. Demanding, controlling, and unwilling to hear no. Don't let her break you. You're stronger than she thinks." I sat back, letting her words wash over me. It was the first time someone within the family had openly acknowledged Evelyn's behavior for what it was. And though it didn't solve everything, it gave me hope that I wasn't completely alone in this fight. But the battle wasn't over yet. I knew Evelyn and Margot wouldn't take this lying down. And judging by the silence from Margot's end, she was likely plotting her next move. I couldn't predict what it would be, but I was determined to be ready for whatever came next. This time, I wasn't just defending my house. I was defending my right to live on my terms, and no amount of public shaming or family pressure was going to take that away from me. The silence from Margot lasted 2 days. That's how long it took before she resurfaced, but not with another social media post. No, this time, she decided to go directly for the jugular. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Camille, but it wasn't her usual supportive check-in. "Lila, you need to see this. Margot's playing dirty." My stomach twisted as I clicked on the link she'd sent me. It led to a local community forum, one of those neighborhood pages where everyone from the area chimed in on anything from lost pets to local events. At the top of the page was a post from Margot. She hadn't used my name, but she didn't need to. Everyone knew who she was talking about. It's sad when someone you trust puts material things over family. All we wanted was a little help during a special time, but some people only care about themselves. I won't name names, but it's heartbreaking to see greed destroy relationships. The comments were piling up fast. "Wow, who would do that? Sounds awful." "Greed ruins families all the time. Stay strong, Margot." "I can't believe someone would choose money over their own sister's happiness." I slammed my laptop shut, my pulse racing. This wasn't just public shaming anymore. This was an outright smear campaign. Margot was deliberately airing our dirty laundry to people I interacted with daily. Neighbors, coworkers, even my boss. This wasn't about family or loyalty. It was about ruining me. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Reacting in anger wouldn't help, but I couldn't just let this slide either. Margot wanted to push me into a corner, to make me feel small and powerless. But she underestimated me. That evening, I called my lawyer again, explaining the new development. "This is crossing a line," I said, my voice shaking with frustration. "She's dragging my name through the mud, and now it's affecting my reputation in the community." "Do you have screenshots of everything?" he asked. "I do," I said, already compiling the evidence. "Good," he replied. "Here's what we can do. If this continues, you can pursue a cease and desist for defamation. It's clear she's targeting you specifically, even if she's not naming you outright. And if her actions cause any tangible harm to your personal or professional life, we can escalate further." Hearing this gave me some relief. I wasn't powerless, no matter how much Margot wanted me to feel that way, but I knew I couldn't rely solely on legal action. If I wanted to stop Margot and Evelyn from trampling over me, I needed to take control of the narrative once and for all. The next day, I decided to confront Margot directly. Not through a text, not through a call, but face to face. It was risky, but I needed her to know that I wasn't going to cower. I drove to her apartment after work, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me. Then her expression shifted to something between smugness and disdain. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said, crossing her arms. "Come to apologize?" "Hardly," I replied, stepping inside. "We need to talk." She rolled her eyes and flopped onto the couch, clearly unbothered. "What's there to talk about? You've made your feelings perfectly clear. You don't care about family." I ignored the bait. "Margot, you've crossed the line. Dragging me through the mud in private is one thing, but airing our business on public forums? That's low, even for you." Her smirk faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Oh, please. I didn't even mention your name." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "You know exactly what you're doing. You're trying to ruin my reputation because I won't bend to your demands. It's manipulative, it's petty, and it's not going to work." For the first time, Margot looked genuinely rattled. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is," she said, her voice defensive. "I just wanted people to see the truth." "No," I said, stepping closer. "You wanted people to see your version of the truth. But here's the real truth, Margot. You're not entitled to my house, my money, or anything else I've worked for. You can try to guilt me, shame me, or turn the whole world against me, but it won't change the fact that I said no." Her face turned red, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But then she let out a bitter laugh. "Fine," she said, standing up. "If you want to ruin this family, that's on you. Just remember, when you're old and alone, you did this to yourself." I didn't flinch. If protecting my peace means losing people who only see me as a resource, then so be it. I walked out of her apartment feeling both drained and empowered. Margot wasn't going to stop, but neither was I. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my voice and refusing to be their scapegoat. As I drove home, I replayed the confrontation in my head. Margot's confidence had cracked, even if just for a moment. She wasn't invincible, and for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over yet. Evelyn and Margot would regroup and come at me again. The question was, how far would they go? And was I ready for it? The fallout from my confrontation with Margot was swift. The next day, I woke up to find that she hadn't taken my words as a call for reflection. Instead, she'd doubled down. Margot had shared another post, this time even more pointed than the last. She still hadn't named me directly, but the insinuations were unmistakable. It's a shame when someone you trust can't see beyond their own selfishness. Some people are so wrapped up in their material possessions that they forget what really matters: family, love, and loyalty. But that's okay. My day will be beautiful, with or without their support. The comments were worse than ever. "You don't need people like that in your life, Margot. Focus on your happiness. Some people only care about money. It's sad, but true." Good riddance to toxic family members. I stared at the screen, a hollow anger blooming in my chest. Margot wasn't backing down. She was escalating, using her flair for theatrics to weaponize public sympathy against me. And yet, I couldn't let myself react emotionally. That was exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to lose my temper, to lash out, to give her more ammunition. Instead, I focused on staying composed. I spent the morning documenting every single post, every comment, and every private message I'd received as a result of her antics. My lawyer's advice echoed in my head. Keep a record of everything. But despite my efforts to stay calm, I couldn't shake the growing unease. Margot and Evelyn were relentless, and if they were willing to go this far, what else were they capable of? I got my answer that afternoon. I was in the middle of a work call when my phone buzzed repeatedly. Ignoring it, I finished the meeting and checked my messages afterward. My stomach dropped. There were texts from Camille, my cousin Clara, and even my Aunt Teresa. "Lila, your mom just called me. Evelyn's telling everyone that you're ungrateful and disrespectful. She even said you're considering selling the house but backing out to spite Margot. Lila, you need to get ahead of this. They're twisting the story so badly it's almost unrecognizable." I sat there stunned. Evelyn wasn't just venting or complaining anymore. She was outright lying. And worse, she was planting seeds of doubt in the minds of people who might otherwise support me. I called Clara first. "What exactly did she say?" "She made it sound like you initially agreed to sell the house," Clara explained, her voice tinged with anger. "Then she said you changed your mind at the last minute to punish Margot. She even implied that you've always been jealous of her." I gritted my teeth. Jealous? That was rich, coming from Evelyn. If anyone had spent their life trying to one-up everyone around her, it was her. And Margot had inherited that same entitlement. "I can't let her get away with this," I said. "She's not just lying. She's destroying my reputation." "You're right," Clara agreed, "but you need to be smart about how you respond. If you go in guns blazing, they'll use it against you." That evening, I sat down to write another post. This one wasn't just a defense, it was a declaration. I knew I needed to set the record straight, not just for my sake, but to show Evelyn and Margot that I wasn't afraid to fight back. Lately, there's been a lot of misinformation circulating about me and my decisions. Let me be clear. I have never agreed to sell my home, nor will I. I've worked hard to build the life I have, and I won't apologize for protecting it. This situation has been twisted into something it's not, and while I understand that emotions are running high, I won't allow lies to define my character. I love my family, but love doesn't mean sacrificing everything you've worked for. Boundaries are not betrayal. Respect goes both ways. I posted it and braced myself for the backlash. Within minutes, the comments started rolling in. Some were supportive, others predictably hostile, but the message was clear. People were paying attention. And for every person siding with Evelyn and Margot, there was someone else questioning their narrative. That night, I received a call from my father. I debated answering it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Lila," he began, his voice strained. "Why are you making this worse? Your mother and Margot are beside themselves." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my tone calm. "I'm not making it worse, Dad. I'm defending myself. They've been lying about me, dragging my name through the mud, and for what? Because I won't sell my house to fund Margot's wedding?" "It's not that simple," he said weakly. "You know how your mother is. She just wants what's best for the family." "No, Dad," I said firmly. "She wants what's best for Margot, and she's willing to destroy me to get it." There was a long pause before he sighed heavily. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can start by standing up to her," I said. "But if you won't, that's on you. Just know that I'm not backing down." When the call ended, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. My father's loyalty to Evelyn had always been unshakable, even when it came at my expense. But this time, I wasn't going to let his inaction drag me down. As I sat in the quiet of my living room, I realized something important. I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. I was fighting for my voice, my independence, and my right to live without being overshadowed by Evelyn and Margot's relentless demands. They might have declared war, but I was ready for battle. And this time, I wasn't playing by their rules. The next few days passed in tense silence. I had expected Evelyn or Margot to escalate again immediately, but they didn't. It was the kind of calm that felt deliberate, as if they were plotting their next move in the shadows. I tried to focus on work, on maintaining a sense of normalcy, but the quiet was unnerving. It was the kind of quiet that always came before one of Evelyn's storms. I didn't have to wait long. It was a Saturday morning when the storm finally arrived. I was watering the plants in my front yard when a familiar car pulled up. Evelyn stepped out, dressed impeccably as always, her heels clicking on the pavement with a sense of authority that I'd once found intimidating. Arthur followed a few steps behind her, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for impact. "Lila," Evelyn said, her voice syrupy sweet but with an undercurrent of tension. "We need to talk." I set the watering can down and crossed my arms. "If this is about the house, we've already talked." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. "It's not about the house. It's about family. And frankly, I think it's time we cleared the air." Arthur said nothing, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder. I had no doubt that Evelyn had dragged him here against his will, just as she always did when she wanted to put on a show of unity. "Fine," I said, stepping back toward the porch. "But I'm not in the mood for more lectures." Evelyn swept past me into the house without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. Arthur followed hesitantly, mumbling an apology under his breath as he entered. I closed the door and turned to face them, already bracing myself for the confrontation. Evelyn sat down on the couch, smoothing her skirt as if she were about to negotiate a business deal. "Lila, you've made your feelings very clear, and we've heard you. But there's something you need to understand. This isn't just about Margot. It's about us, about this family. Do you really want to be the reason we fall apart?" I stared at her, incredulous. "Fall apart? Mom, you've spent weeks dragging my name through the mud because I won't sell my house. If anyone's tearing this family apart, it's you." She didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do to get your attention. You've been so stubborn, so unreasonable." "Unreasonable?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You're the one who's unreasonable. You're asking me to give up everything I've worked for a wedding. A wedding, Mom. And when I said no, you decided to destroy my reputation instead of respecting my decision." Arthur shifted uncomfortably, finally speaking up. "Evelyn, maybe we should—" "Arthur!" she snapped, cutting him off. "Stay out of this." I turned to him, my voice softening. "Dad, don't you see what's happening here? She's using you, using both of us, to get what she wants." Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn was already standing, her composure beginning to crack. "This isn't about me," she hissed. "It's about Margot and her future. She deserves this, Lila. She deserves to have her dream wedding. And I deserve to keep the life I've built," I said firmly. "You've always put Margot first, Mom. Always. But this time, I'm not sacrificing myself for her." Evelyn's face turned red, and for a moment I thought she might explode. But instead, she let out a bitter laugh. "Fine," she said, grabbing her purse. "If that's how you feel, don't expect us to be there when you need us. You've made your choice, Lila. Don't come crying to me when you realize what you've lost." She stormed toward the door, pausing only to glare at Arthur. "Are you coming?" Arthur hesitated, his gaze flickering between us. Go," I said, cutting him off. "You always do." He looked at me, his eyes filled with something that resembled guilt, but in the end, he followed Evelyn out the door. I stood there in the silence they left behind, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and sadness. For the first time, I realized that Evelyn's words didn't scare me. They didn't have the power they once did. I wasn't a frightened little girl anymore, desperate for her approval. I was an adult, and I had every right to stand my ground. I walked back to the porch, staring out at the garden I'd worked so hard to create. This was my space, my sanctuary, and no matter how hard they tried, they weren't going to take it from me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. The storm had passed. For now. And while I knew they weren't done trying to undermine me, I also knew something else. I wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. The calm didn't last long. Evelyn and Margot weren't the kind of people to accept defeat quietly. I knew they'd regroup, and when they did, they'd strike harder. The question wasn't if, it was when. A week passed without much noise. The social media posts stopped, the calls from extended family slowed, and for a moment, I thought maybe they'd finally given up. I should have known better. It was a quiet Thursday evening when the next blow came. I'd just finished dinner and was curled up on the couch with a book when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my bank, a security alert. A new mortgage inquiry has been made on your property. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A mortgage inquiry? I hadn't requested one. My heart pounded as I logged into my account, my fingers trembling. Sure enough, there it was. A recent inquiry tied to my house, something I hadn't authorized. Panic turned to anger as realization dawned. Evelyn. She had access to some of my old financial information. Back when I'd first bought the house, I'd foolishly shared certain details with her, trusting that she wouldn't misuse them. Clearly, I'd underestimated her. I called my bank immediately, explaining the situation. The representative confirmed that an inquiry had been made, but reassured me that no changes had been made to my account or mortgage. Still, the fact that someone had even tried was enough to send my blood boiling. "Can you tell me who made the request?" I asked. The representative hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't release that information over the phone. You may need to file a formal dispute and involve legal representation if you suspect fraud." Fraud. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and cold. That's exactly what this was. Fraud. Evelyn had crossed a line, and this time, it wasn't just manipulation or public shaming. This was illegal. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and fear. How far were they willing to go? Was this just Evelyn's doing, or was Margot involved too? The thought of them conspiring to mess with my finances sent a chill down my spine. Without hesitation, I called my lawyer and explained everything. He listened carefully, his voice calm but firm. "This is serious, Lila. If your mother is attempting to interfere with your mortgage, she could face legal consequences. I suggest we move quickly on this. Document everything. File a report with your bank, and consider involving law enforcement." Law enforcement. The thought made my stomach churn. As much as I wanted to protect myself, the idea of taking legal action against my own mother felt like a line I didn't want to cross. But what choice did I have? She'd already crossed every boundary I'd set. If I didn't stand up now, what would she try next? The next day, I filed the necessary paperwork with my bank and flagged my accounts for additional security. I also started drafting a formal letter to Evelyn, warning her to cease any further attempts to interfere with my finances. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was necessary. Evelyn needed to understand that there were consequences for her actions. By the time the weekend arrived, I was emotionally drained. I hadn't confronted Evelyn yet. I wanted to make sure all my bases were covered first. But when she called me that Saturday afternoon, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. "Lila," she began, her tone brisk and sharp, "we need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, my voice cold. "Because the last time we talked, you tried to guilt me into selling my house. And now I find out there's been a fraudulent inquiry on my mortgage. Care to explain?" There was a brief pause, and for a moment I thought she might deny it. But then she let out a frustrated sigh. "I did what I had to do, Lila. You weren't listening to reason. I thought if I could just—" "You thought what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. That you could manipulate my finances to get what you wanted? Do you even hear yourself, Mom? This isn't just unethical, it's criminal. Don't be so dramatic, she snapped. Nothing happened, did it? You're overreacting. Overreacting? I repeated, incredulous. You tried to tamper with my house, Mom. My house. You've crossed every line, and you think I'm overreacting? I'm your mother, she said, her voice defensive. I know what's best for you. No, you know what's best for Margot, I shot back. You've always known what's best for her, and the rest of us are just pawns in your game. Her silence spoke volumes, and for the first time, I felt a sense of power in the conversation. Evelyn wasn't used to being called out, and she certainly wasn't used to losing. This ends now, I said firmly. If you try anything like this again, I will take legal action. Do you understand me? You wouldn't, she said, but her voice wavered. Try me, I replied, my tone steady. I've had enough, Mom. You don't get to control me anymore. I hung up before she could respond, my heart racing. The conversation had been brutal, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I'd truly stood my ground. Evelyn might not back down easily, but now she knew that I wasn't afraid to fight back. That night, as I sat in the quiet of my home, I felt a strange sense of peace. The storm wasn't over, but I'd weathered this round. And no matter what Evelyn or Margot threw at me next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to lose. Not this time. Not ever. Days passed without a word from Evelyn or Margot. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, but the silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. It wasn't like Evelyn to retreat, not after everything she'd done. It felt more like she was regrouping, strategizing her next move. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on protecting myself. I added extra security measures to my financial accounts and followed up with my lawyer, ensuring every piece of evidence was documented and ready should things escalate again. Despite the calm, I knew better than to let my guard down. Then, one evening, Clara called. Her tone was hushed, almost conspiratorial. Lila, I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but you need to know. Margot's been talking to Aunt Nora about selling some of your things. What? I asked, my voice sharp with disbelief. What do you mean selling my things? She's telling people that you've been thinking about downsizing, Clara explained. She's even hinted that you might leave the house entirely and let the family take over. I felt my chest tighten, my anger rising. She's spreading lies again? What is wrong with her? It's worse than that, Clara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I think she's trying to make it look like you're preparing to leave the house. If enough people believe it, she might try to push something through legally. My blood ran cold. It sounded far-fetched. But given everything Evelyn and Margot had done so far, it wasn't impossible. They had a way of twisting reality to suit their agenda, and I wouldn't put it past them to try something drastic. Thanks for telling me, I said, my mind racing. I'll handle it. After I hung up, I sat there in silence, the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. They weren't just trying to pressure me anymore. They were trying to rewrite the narrative entirely. If I didn't act fast, they might actually convince people that I was giving up the house. The next day, I decided to get ahead of them. I called a meeting with my lawyer to discuss what steps I could take to protect my property and reputation further. We talked about everything. Filing a cease and desist letter, securing public records that proved my ownership, and even issuing a formal statement if necessary. You need to establish a clear paper trail, my lawyer advised. The more proactive you are, the harder it'll be for them to argue otherwise. I left the meeting feeling more prepared, but the weight of it all still hung heavy. The idea that my own family was trying to strip me of everything I'd worked for, it was almost too much to process. Almost. Later that week, I received a surprise visit. It wasn't Evelyn or Margot, but my father. He showed up unannounced, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by a kind of nervous energy that made me immediately wary. "Dad," I said, standing in the doorway, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to talk," he said quickly. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, but finally stepped aside, letting him into the house. He glanced around, his hands fidgeting as if he didn't know what to do with them. For a moment, he just stood there, looking everywhere but at me. "Lila," he began, his voice low, "I didn't know about the mortgage thing. I swear I didn't." I crossed my arms. "Then what are you doing here? Did Evelyn send you?" He shook his head quickly. She doesn't even know I'm here. I wanted to say I'm sorry." The words caught me off guard. Arthur Vaughn, the man who had spent his life standing silently by while Evelyn orchestrated every scheme, was apologizing. I didn't know whether to believe him. "Sorry for what exactly?" I asked, my tone guarded. "For letting it get this far," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "For not standing up to your mother when I should have. For letting her drag you into all of this." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell, to demand why he hadn't done anything sooner. But another part of me saw the weight he carried, the years of enabling Evelyn and Margot finally catching up to him. "I can't change what's happened," he continued. "But I need you to know that I don't agree with what she's done. I don't want to lose you, Lila." I took a deep breath, my emotions swirling. "Then do something about it, Dad. Stop letting her control everything. Stop standing on the sidelines while she tries to destroy me." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I'll try," he said softly. "I don't know if it'll make a difference, but I'll try." As he left, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there. Maybe, just maybe, Arthur Vaughn was finally waking up to the damage Evelyn and Margot were causing. But as much as I wanted to believe in that flicker of hope, I knew better than to rely on it. This fight wasn't over, and if Evelyn and Margot thought they could outmaneuver me, they were in for a rude awakening. Arthur's unexpected apology lingered in my mind for days. It wasn't like him to go against Evelyn, even in private. His visit felt like a crack in the armor of their united front, but I wasn't naive enough to think it signaled a real change. Apologies were easy. Action was harder. And Evelyn didn't strike me as the type to let Arthur step out of line without consequences. I didn't have to wait long to see just how true that was. It was a quiet Friday evening when the next blow came. I was scrolling through emails when one from my neighborhood association caught my attention. The subject line read, "Proposal to address property transition, community notice." Frowning, I clicked on it. The email described a proposal brought to the association by concerned parties about transitioning ownership of properties that were underutilized in the community. Specifically, it referenced properties owned by single individuals with excess space. It didn't name names, but I didn't need a name to know it was aimed at me. They'd gone from manipulating family to manipulating my neighbors. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Evelyn must have been behind this. She'd spun a narrative to my neighbors, likely under the guise of looking out for the community, all to pressure me into giving up my home. It was underhanded, even for her. I called Clara immediately, relaying what I'd just read. She was furious. "They're targeting your neighbors now? That's low, even for Aunt Evelyn." I'm not sure what to do, I admitted, my voice shaking. I can't believe she'd go this far. You need to speak up, Clara said firmly. Get ahead of this before it gains traction. If she's involving the neighborhood association, she's hoping to rally public pressure. Don't let her. Clara was right, of course. Evelyn's plan was transparent. Make me look like a selfish recluse hoarding space in a community where family values were everything. She'd weaponize every neighborly conversation, every shared smile, turning people I barely knew against me. That night, I wrote a formal response to the association, clearly stating my position. I outlined my history with the house, my contributions to the community, and my right to live in the home I'd worked so hard to own. I didn't mention Evelyn or Margot by name, but I made it clear that the proposal was baseless and invasive. I sent the email off, CCing my lawyer, and hoped it would be enough to stop Evelyn's latest scheme. The following week, I attended the association's monthly meeting to address the issue directly. It was a small gathering in a community center, but as soon as I walked in, I could feel the tension in the room. Several neighbors glanced my way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled judgment. Evelyn was there, of course, sitting toward the front like a queen presiding over her court. She didn't look at me, but I could feel her presence, cold and calculating. She'd clearly positioned herself as the champion of family-oriented values, framing the proposal as a community effort rather than a personal attack. When the time came for public discussion, I stood up. My voice was steady, but inside, I was seething. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, I began. I've lived in this community for 5 years, and I've worked hard to make my house a home. Recently, I became aware of a proposal suggesting that single individuals like me are underutilizing space and should consider transitioning ownership. I want to be clear. This proposal is not about community betterment. It's about personal agendas. It's an attempt to manipulate my neighbors into forcing me out of my home. A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn shifted in her seat, her face impassive, but her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. I've spent my life earning what I have, I continued, and I won't apologize for it. My house isn't just a piece of property, it's my sanctuary, my safe place. I've contributed to this community in many ways, and I have no intention of leaving. I respect my neighbors, and I ask that you respect me in return. The room was silent as I sat down, my heart pounding. For a moment, I worried that I'd said too much or too little. But then one of my neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Abbott, stood up. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, she said, her voice clear and firm. And I've seen a lot of families come and go. What I haven't seen is someone trying to push out a neighbor just because they don't fit their definition of what a homeowner should be. Lila has every right to stay in her home, and I, for one, support her. A ripple of agreement followed her words, and I felt a wave of relief. Evelyn's plan wasn't working. Not here. Not with these people. As the meeting wrapped up, I noticed Evelyn leaving in a huff, her face tight with barely concealed frustration. She didn't even glance in my direction. Later that evening, Clara called. I heard what happened at the meeting, she said, clearly impressed. You handled it perfectly, Lila. Evelyn wasn't expecting you to fight back like that. She's running out of options, I said, though I knew better than to think she was finished. Evelyn wasn't the type to let go easily. Still, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had won a battle. It wasn't over, but I was stronger now, more determined than ever to protect what was mine. Evelyn and Margot could try every trick in the book, but I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The aftermath of the neighborhood meeting felt like the final ripple of a long, tumultuous storm. For weeks, Evelyn and Margot had done everything in their power to control me, to force me into submission. But now, they were silent. No calls, no messages, no cryptic posts online. It wasn't peace, it was retreat. A reluctant acknowledgement that their tactics had failed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The house felt different, lighter, like it was mine in a way it hadn't been before. I started spending more time in my garden, reclaiming the small joys that had been overshadowed by weeks of stress and conflict. Each weed I pulled, each flower I planted, felt like a step toward closure. One quiet morning, as I sipped coffee on the porch, I saw Arthur's car pull into the driveway. For a moment, I considered ignoring him, letting him sit there until he gave up and left. But something about the way he hesitated before getting out of the car made me pause. "Dad," I said as he approached, "what are you doing here?" He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slouched and his face lined with guilt. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "For real this time." I crossed my arms, unsure whether to believe him. "Go on." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know I've let you down, Lila. I've let your mother run the show for so long because it was easier than fighting her. But that doesn't make it right. And what she tried to do to you, it wasn't right. None of it was." I studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but he seemed genuine. "Why now, Dad? Why not years ago, when it might have made a difference?" "Because I didn't think I had a choice," he admitted. "But seeing what she's put you through, what we've put you through, made me realize I can't keep doing this. You deserve better." His words hit a nerve I hadn't realized was still raw. I wanted to yell, to ask him why he hadn't stood up for me when it mattered most. But instead, I took a deep breath. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally. "But it doesn't erase everything." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I just wanted you to know that I'm on your side now, whatever that means." He left shortly after, leaving me with a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant what he said. But another part of me knew that trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. Still, it felt like the beginning of something, not reconciliation, but maybe understanding. As the days turned into weeks, life slowly returned to normal. Evelyn and Margot remained quiet, their presence reduced to whispers on the edges of my world. I wasn't sure if they'd truly given up or if they were simply regrouping, but I decided not to waste any more energy worrying about them. This was my time to heal, to rebuild. One sunny afternoon, I decided to make a change. The backyard, which I'd neglected during all the chaos, had become overgrown and wild. I spent the entire day clearing weeds, planting new flowers, and rearranging the space. By the time I was done, it looked like a completely different yard, a fresh start, full of color and life. As I sat on the porch that evening, admiring my work, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. For so long, I'd let my family dictate my choices, my emotions, my life. But now, I realized I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I was enough, just as I was. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Evelyn's. I stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. "Lila," it began. "I don't know how to fix what's happened between us, but I hope we can find a way to move forward. I still believe family is important, even if we don't always see eye to eye. I'm sorry if I pushed too hard. I just wanted what I thought was best. Take care of yourself." It wasn't much of an apology, but it felt like the closest thing to one Evelyn could muster. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure what to make of it. Maybe she was trying to mend fences, or maybe it was just another tactic to keep the door open for future manipulation. Either way, it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for closure from her. I'd already found it in myself. As the sun set that evening, casting golden light across my little house, I smiled. This was my home, my sanctuary, my proof that I could stand tall in the face of anything. Evelyn and Margot could plot, scheme, or retreat. It didn't matter anymore. I had won. And for the first time in years, I felt free.